A reading from Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 4, beginning at verse 4. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. This letter of Paul's to the Galatians is a letter which is very much dealing with the relationship of the Old Testament law and Jesus himself. It's written to a group of people who are thinking that they need to keep the Old Testament law alongside being a Christian. And one of the parts of the Old Testament law that is at issue in this letter is all to do with circumcision, which is, as you know, part of the Old Testament law. But you will have noticed as well that circumcision is not part of Christianity. So something has changed before and after Jesus. Jesus operates as something as a hinge. He fulfills the Old Testament law and then brings something new into being. This is why Paul writes at the beginning of the passage, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law. The law here being, of course, the Old Testament law, all those regulations, the round of sacrifices and everything that was carrying on at the time of Jesus' birth. And the law demonstrates to us something of God's character. You can see this, you can understand this. If you want to understand the things that are important to a nation, well, you look at that nation's laws and you can see something of the character of that nation. If back in the day you wanted to see something of the character of a king in this country, well, you would look at the laws that that king enacted. It would tell you what was important to that king. And the laws that God enacts in the Old Testament tell us something of the nature of God, the perfection of God, and yet we are not perfect. Paul brings this to the fore in the previous chapter, in chapter 3, where he writes, For all who rely on works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, Cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. So we have the book of the law, we have the Old Testament, we have all the regulations given to Moses at Sinai, and yet we can't keep them. We are fallen people, we're a frail people, and we're cursed because of it, as Paul points out, because we're not abiding by the commands of God. So what to do? Well, the answer comes in this passage, that Jesus, who's born of a woman, born under the law, redeems us. He does keep the law. He keeps it perfectly because he is both fully man, but also fully God. And so he has that ability that we lack to keep the law entirely. And yet he suffers and dies upon the cross. Well, why would that be? What is it that means that he has to suffer in that way? Well, we know from the Old Testament that it's because he's under a curse. Cursed is the one who hangs on a tree, we read, and Jesus was killed and put up upon a cross, hung upon a tree. And so he was cursed, but he can't have been cursed because of his own acts, because he was perfect in the way that he kept the law. So whose curse is it? Well, it is ours. Cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law. This is what Paul points out to us. So he has taken our curse, taken our place, and we may be therefore joined to him. Our sins may be forgiven because he bore the curse, the punishment which lay upon our shoulders. And because of that, he's now reopened the way back to God, and we can share in his righteousness. We can be called rather, sons. We're adopted as sons. This isn't anything to do whether you're male or female. We are all sons because we're all adopted as Christ was, the Son of God. We are standing alongside. God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts. So we're all sons in that way, male or female. We're all sons, and we may therefore cry out to God, Abba, Father. This is the point that Paul makes. So he concludes, you are no longer a slave but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. So this passage answers something of that question, why do we have Christmas? Why isn't it that God simply clicked his fingers and made everything all right? Well, the answer is because he's a God of justice. And he needed to redeem people who were cursed because they were not keeping the Old Testament law. They were not living in the manner that God mandated. So he sends his son at the fullness of time, who was born of a woman, born under the law, to die in the place of those, to absorb the curse of those who are not keeping the law, so that in return those who trust in him, who share in that sacrifice, who seek to follow his path, we may be all called sons of God because we have the Spirit of the Son dwelling within us. That's why we have Christmas, because it's the beginning of that path. It's the beginning of Jesus, born of a woman, living that perfect life, avoiding that curse, but being cursed for us nonetheless and absorbing that curse. He didn't deserve it, but we did. This is why we have Christmas, because it's the beginning of that work, culminating with the death, resurrection and ascension of Christ, which reconciles us to God. So Christmas is more than simply the baby in the manger. It is that. It's also the first step on that path that reconciles us back to God.